The doctors had done everything right, and that was the problem. 20 of the best minds in modern medicine stood around the hospital bed, staring at a woman who refused to return to the world. And none of them realized they were already looking at the wrong answer. Claire Whitmore, 29 years old heiress to a pharmaceutical empire worth billions, lay perfectly still beneath the sterile lights, her chest rising and falling with mechanical precision, while her eyes stared past everyone, as if they no longer existed. 6 months earlier, Claire had been unstoppable. She moved through boardrooms with the calm authority of someone born into power, but sharp enough to keep it. Magazine covers had called her the future of American biotech. Analysts praised her discipline, her restraint, her refusal to chase hype. Now she lay silent in a private neurological ward at Johnsfield Medical Center in Boston, a mystery no scan could explain. Her heart was strong, her brain showed activity, her muscles were intact. Yet she did not speak, she did not respond, she did not blink when her name was called. The specialists came and went in waves. Neurologists, psychiatrists, toxicologists, sleep experts. They ran tests until the machines grew warm. They spoke in careful tones outside her room. Words like idiopathic, psychosomatic, unprecedented. Some hinted gently at irreversible damage. Others suggested waiting. None could say why a perfectly healthy young woman had simply stopped reaching back toward life. Each night the room returned to silence, broken only by the steady, indifferent beep of machines that never questioned their own certainty. Daniel Brooks entered that silence quietly, pushing a cleaning cart that squeaked despite his best efforts to oil its wheels. At 41, he moved with the habit of someone who had learned not to draw attention. Gray uniform, worn gloves, eyes always lowered not from shame, but from experience. The night shift paid less, but it came with health insurance, and that mattered more than pride. His daughter Lily was 8 bright, stubborn, and asthmatic, and the inhalers alone cost more than his weekly groceries. Daniel had not planned this life. 3 years earlier, his wife Emily had died slowly, painfully from a cancer that ignored every treatment thrown at it. Daniel had learned then that grief did not arrive like a storm. It crept in like fog, thick and suffocating, settling into places you did not know could ache. He took the janitor job after the funeral, trading ambition for stability, visibility, for survival. He learned to work while the world slept, to clean around people who never noticed him, to listen more than he spoke. For 3 weeks, Daniel had been assigned to Claire Whitmore's floor. He cleaned her room every night, at the same time, wiping surfaces no one touched, emptying bins no one filled. He had memorized the rhythm of the machines, the faint hum of the ventilation near the window, and the way moonlight pooled on the floor just short of her bed. He never spoke to her. He assumed, like everyone else, that she could not hear him. Still, he moved carefully, as if she might. It was on a Thursday night, sometime after midnight, when something broke the pattern. Daniel was polishing the narrow table by the window when his elbow nudged a small decorative stone bowl. It tipped, rolled, and struck the floor with a dull crack that echoed too loudly in the quiet room. Daniel froze instinctively, glancing toward the hallway, expecting a nurse. There was none. But something else had changed. He looked back at the bed. Claire's fingers had moved. It was not dramatic. No sudden grasp, no twitch that screamed miracle. Just the slightest curl of her right hand, as subtle as a reflex. Daniel stared, his breath held without realizing it. He waited. Nothing followed. He told himself it was involuntary, the kind of meaningless motion doctors dismissed every day. He bent to pick up the bowl, set it back in place, and tried to forget the tightness forming in his chest. But then it happened again. As Daniel pushed his cart closer to the window, the metal frame rattling softly, Claire's eyes shifted. Not much. Not enough for anyone rushing through, but enough for someone who had learned to read what was never said. Her gaze drifted slow and imprecise toward the sound. Daniel straightened, his pulse suddenly loud in his ears. He moved back, her eyes stilled. He stepped forward again. They followed. Daniel thought of Lily, of the nights she had sat silent on her bed after her mother died, refusing to cry, refusing to speak, communicating only through the way she twisted the corner of her blanket until her knuckles went white. He thought of how everyone else had said she was fine, while he knew she was drowning. He had learned then that silence was not absence. It was a language. Carefully, deliberately, Daniel tested it. He dropped his cleaning rag. Claire's head turned just a fraction, but unmistakably toward the sound. He moved to the other side of the room and nudged the cart. Her eyes tracked again, slow but intentional. Daniel felt the world tilt beneath him. This was not coincidence. This was not muscle memory. This was awareness trapped behind a body that refused to obey. She was not gone. She was locked in. Daniel stepped back, his hands trembling despite his effort to steady them. 20 doctors had stood where he stood now. They had spoken to her, shined lights in her eyes, called her name, touched her skin. And they had missed this because they were listening for answers they expected to hear. Daniel, the man who scrubbed their floors and emptied their trash, had seen what they could not because he was used to listening to the quiet. In that moment, Daniel Brooks understood something that would change everything. Claire Whitmore was not unresponsive. She was imprisoned. And the only reason he had seen the door was because no one had bothered to look through his eyes. By morning, the hospital had returned to its familiar rhythm of controlled urgency, but Daniel Brooks had not slept at all. The image of Claire Whitmore's eyes following sound replayed in his mind with merciless clarity, looping over and over until it drowned out everything else. He moved through the corridors in a quiet haze, pushing his cart, scrubbing floors that gleamed under fluorescent lights, nodding politely to nurses who passed him without recognition. To them, he was background noise, part of the building itself. But inside Daniel's chest sat a truth that felt too large, too dangerous to carry unnoticed. He understood exactly what was at stake. Hospitals were ruled by hierarchy, by credentials earned through years of study and reinforced by ego. A janitor claiming to see what 20 specialists had missed was not brave, it was reckless. He could be dismissed, laughed at, reported. Worse, he could lose the job that paid for Lily's medication and the job that kept his daughter breathing through the long winter nights. Every sensible instinct told him to stay silent. Yet every time fear tried to silence him, he remembered the way Claire's gaze had moved slow, but deliberate, like a hand tapping once on glass from the other side. Dr. Susan Miller was not a woman who welcomed interruptions. At 52, she carried herself with the authority of someone who had spent decades earning the right to be certain. Daniel waited until he saw her near the elevators, walking fast, eyes fixed on a tablet filled with neurological scans. His heart pounded so hard it felt audible. When he spoke, his voice came out low but steady, cutting through the space, just enough to be heard. She barely slowed irritation already forming, until he said the one thing that forced her to stop. He did not beg. He did not speculate. He stated what he had seen simply and precisely. Back in Claire's room, the air seemed to tighten, as if the walls themselves were listening. Dr. Miller stood with her arms crossed, skepticism etched into every line of her posture, while Daniel moved with deliberate care. He said nothing. He let the room speak. A chair scraped softly against the floor, and Claire's eyes shifted. Keys fell metal against tile, and her head turned just enough to break denial. Dr. Miller's breath caught the sound sharp in the quiet. Again and again, the pattern repeated, undeniable now. The silence that followed was not empty. It was stunned, reverent, heavy, with the weight of a truth no one had wanted to see. Within hours, the case exploded back to life. Tests were redesigned, assumptions dismantled, timelines rewritten. Specialists returned with different questions, different tools, different humility. Buried in Claire's history beneath layers of confident conclusions lay the trigger, a rare neurological reaction caused by an obscure combination of supplements she had taken to fight chronic fatigue. The diagnosis came quietly, but landed with force. An atypical locked-in syndrome. Her mind had never left. Her body had simply betrayed her. As the realization settled, shame and awe moved through the team in equal measure. And Dr. Miller made one thing clear. The breakthrough belonged to Daniel Brooks. Daniel tried to disappear back into his routine, but the world no longer allowed it. 3 days later, a man waited beside his cart dressed in tailored black, his posture rigid with barely restrained emotion. Richard Whitmore did not speak like a billionaire or a titan of industry. He spoke like a father who had nearly lost his child while standing helplessly beside her. He thanked Daniel, offered him more than money could justify, more than gratitude could explain. Daniel listened and then shook his head. He spoke of paying attention, of caring enough to notice what others overlook. When Richard's voice broke and he begged to help, Lily Daniel finally nodded, not for himself, but for his daughter's future. 6 months later, Claire Whitmore walked out of the hospital under her own strength, sunlight catching her face as cameras flashed. At the press conference, she refused to speak until Daniel stood beside her, awkward and out-of-place, hands clasped tightly in front of him. Her words were calm, deliberate, and devastating in their simplicity. The most important moment of her survival had not come from expertise alone, but from compassion sharpened by attention. Daniel listened from her side, thinking not of headlines or praise, but of Lily breathing easily in her sleep. He understood then that true power often lives where no one bothers to look, waiting for someone brave enough to notice. Claire Whitmore did not wake up all at once. Her return to the world was slow, fragmented, and terrifying in ways no one outside her mind could fully grasp. For 6 months, she had been conscious aware, listening to voices move around her, as if she were furniture, feeling time stretch and fold in on itself. Now, as the diagnosis spread and the room filled with renewed urgency, she remained trapped behind uncooperative muscles, able to perceive hope without yet being able to touch it. Relief and panic lived side by side inside her, indistinguishable from each other. The doctors spoke differently now. Their tones were careful, almost apologetic, as if volume alone could make up for lost time. They explained the plan, the therapy, the experimental protocols, meant to rebuild pathways between brain and body. Claire understood every word. She wanted to scream that she had understood all along, that she had been listening while they debated whether she was still there. But her mouth would not move. Her hands lay heavy at her sides, disobedient and foreign, reminding her that awareness without control was its own form of torture. Daniel continued to clean her room at night, though now nurses watched him with curiosity instead of indifference. He felt the shift in how people looked at him, a subtle recalibration that made him uncomfortable. He did not want to be a symbol or a miracle. He only wanted to make sure Claire was not forgotten again. When he worked, he spoke softly, narrating what he was doing, not because the doctors had asked him to, but because it felt wrong not to. Claire could not respond, but inside she clung to the sound of his voice like a lifeline. For the first time, Claire began to recognize him not as a shadow, but as a presence. She studied Daniel in the small ways available to her, memorizing the careful economy of his movements, the way he paused before shifting furniture, the way he listened to a room before acting within it. There was something practiced about him, something beyond simple habit. He moved like a man trained to notice patterns others ignored, like someone who understood that the smallest disturbance could mean everything. The realization unsettled her. This man was not who he appeared to be. Physical therapy began aggressively. Sessions blurred together, marked by exhaustion and frustration, as therapists coaxed tiny responses from muscles long silent. A finger twitch became a victory. An eyelid closing on command felt like a miracle. Each gain cost Claire immense effort, leaving her mind sharp and her body trembling. At night, when the room emptied again, she lay awake replaying the months she had spent imprisoned in her own awareness. She remembered the doctors arguing, the pity in her father's voice, the moments when she had almost let herself give up, when hope felt like a cruelty rather than a comfort. Daniel never treated her like a broken thing. He spoke to her the same way every night, grounded, respectful, never rushed. He told her about Lily, about school projects and inhalers, and the small victories that came with being a single parent. He never mentioned what he had done for her, never claimed credit. To Claire, that restraint spoke louder than any speech. She had spent her life surrounded by people eager to be seen. Daniel seemed determined to remain invisible, even now. One night after a particularly brutal therapy session, Claire managed something new. When Daniel entered the room and spoke her name, she forced her eyelids closed and opened them again, slow but deliberate. He froze, his breath catching. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Daniel smiled, not wide or triumphant, but quiet and steady, as if he had known this would happen all along. Claire felt tears gather in her eyes, the first physical expression of emotion she had reclaimed. In that instant, she understood she was no longer alone inside herself. As days passed, questions began to surface. Nurses whispered, doctors speculated. How had Daniel seen what no one else had? Where had that level of observation come from? Some assumed it was instinct, others coincidence. Daniel deflected every inquiry with polite brevity, redirecting attention back to Claire's recovery. But the curiosity lingered, especially for Dr. Susan Miller, who had begun to review Daniel's employee file late at night. It was thin, too thin. No college listed, no advanced training, just years of quiet employment in roles that kept him unnoticed. It did not match the man she had seen in that room. Claire noticed the tension building around him even before she could speak. She saw the way conversations stopped when Daniel approached the way people studied him. Now trying to reconcile the janitor with the man who had unlocked a medical dead end. From her bed, she felt a surge of protectiveness she did not yet have the strength to voice. Whatever Daniel's past was, it was clearly something he had chosen to leave behind. She recognized that choice. Power learned to hide often did so for a reason. One afternoon, during a rare moment alone with her father, Claire managed her first word. It came out hoarse and fragile, but unmistakable. Daniel. Richard Whitmore froze, tears instantly filling his eyes. He leaned close, gripping her hand, as if afraid she might slip away again. She did not say thank you. She did not explain. She simply repeated the name, anchoring it in the room. To her, Daniel Brooks was not a footnote in her recovery. He was the turning point, the proof that seeing mattered more than status. That night, Daniel cleaned her room as usual, unaware of the quiet decision forming in Claire's mind. As she listened to the familiar rhythm of his work, she promised herself something. When she could finally speak freely, when she could stand and face the world again, she would make sure the man everyone underestimated would never be invisible by accident again. Not because he sought recognition, but because the world needed to understand what it had almost missed. The first real shift happened on a morning when the room felt too small to contain what was coming. Claire Whitmore lay propped against white pillows, her body exhausted from another round of therapy, her mind sharper than ever. She could now blink on command, turn her head a few inches, curl one finger when she concentrated hard enough. To the doctors, it was progress measured in millimeters. To Claire, it was the slow reclaiming of herself. And with each small victory came a growing awareness that the world around her was changing in ways she could feel but not yet fully control. Dr. Susan Miller stood at the foot of the bed that morning with a tablet in her hands and hesitation in her eyes. She had spent nights replaying the moment Daniel Brooks had demonstrated the pattern no one else had seen. It had shaken her confidence, not in science, but in its blind spots. Now, as she reviewed new scans and data points, she realized something even more unsettling. Claire's recovery curve did not fit any known model. The response times, the selective sensory pathways, the way environmental sound bypassed traditional auditory processing, all pointed to a neurological profile so rare it bordered on theoretical. "We missed this," Dr. Miller admitted quietly, more to herself than anyone else. The room was silent except for the machines, faithful and indifferent. Not because we weren't capable, but because we were too certain. Claire wanted to tell her that certainty was often the most dangerous thing in any room. She had built her own career on calculated restraint, on questioning assumptions before they hardened into doctrine. And yet, here she was, nearly lost to a system that had assumed it already knew how her story would end. The irony was sharp, almost bitter, and it fueled a new determination inside her. If she survived this, she would not return to the world unchanged. Daniel felt the shift too, though no one had told him directly. His presence was no longer tolerated as background. Nurses asked his opinion without realizing they were doing it. Therapists adjusted their sessions based on what he observed during the night. It made him uneasy. He had spent years perfecting the art of staying unnoticed, of keeping his head down and his past buried. Attention was dangerous. Attention asked questions. And Daniel had learned long ago that some questions once asked could never be taken back. Late one night, as he wiped down the windowsill, Daniel noticed something new. Claire's breathing changed when certain machines hummed. Not alarms, not voices, but low-frequency vibrations, barely audible to anyone else. He paused listening, then shifted the position of a monitor by a few inches. Claire's eyes moved instantly. Daniel swallowed hard. This was deeper than sound. This was sensory mapping. Her brain was rerouting, adapting, surviving in ways no protocol had prepared for. The next day, Dr. Miller ordered a full reassessment of Claire's sensory processing pathways. The results stunned even the skeptics. Claire's brain was compensating for the damaged communication routes by amplifying peripheral stimuli. The body had not shut down. It had rerouted. Survival had found another way. And once again, it was Daniel's quiet observation that had pointed them in the right direction. Word of the findings reached beyond the hospital walls. Research teams called. Journals expressed interest. Grants were discussed in low voices behind closed doors. Claire Whitmore's case was no longer just a medical anomaly. It was a potential breakthrough. But with that attention came pressure, and with pressure came risk. Claire felt it immediately. Decisions were being made around her for her without her consent, just as they had been during the months she could not respond. One afternoon during a therapy session that left her shaking with exhaustion, Claire forced out a full sentence for the first time. The words were rough, uneven, but unmistakable. "No more tests without me." The room froze. Dr. Miller stared at her, stunned, then nodded slowly. It was not the demand of a patient. It was the assertion of a woman reclaiming authority over her own body. From that moment on, the dynamic shifted. Claire was no longer a subject. She was a participant. She listened to every proposal, questioned every assumption, and pushed back when something felt wrong. Daniel watched this transformation quietly from the edges of the room, recognizing the familiar shape of leadership asserting itself under pressure. This was the Claire Whitmore he had only heard about, in passing the one who commanded rooms without raising her voice. That same afternoon, Richard Whitmore requested a private meeting with Dr. Miller. As Claire rested, he stood in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I want to know who that man is," he said, meaning Daniel, not his job title. Him. Dr. Miller hesitated, then admitted what she knew, which was very little. The file was thin. The gaps were too clean. It unsettled her. Richard nodded slowly. "People don't disappear like that unless they're hiding something," he said. "Or protecting someone." Claire sensed the shift even before she heard about it. She could feel the attention narrowing around Daniel the way conversations hushed when he entered a space. It made her uneasy. She had spent her life under scrutiny and knew how easily curiosity could turn into intrusion. That night, when Daniel came to clean her room, she focused every ounce of energy she had left and spoke again, clearer this time. "They're watching you," she said. Daniel froze. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he met her eyes, truly met them, and nodded once. "They always do," he replied quietly. There was no fear in his voice, only acceptance, as if this was a pattern he recognized well. Claire understood then that Daniel Brooks was not simply a man who noticed small things. He was a man who had learned to survive by staying unseen. As the room fell back into its familiar night rhythm, Claire made another decision. Whatever Daniel was running from, whatever past that he had chosen to bury beneath a janitor's uniform, she would not allow him to be consumed by the same system that had nearly erased her. Power, she knew now, was not just the ability to command. It was the responsibility to protect. And when she walked out of this hospital, she intended to use hers deliberately. The questions Daniel Brooks had avoided for years finally began to circle him like predators that had caught the scent of blood. It started subtly with polite curiosity disguised as admiration. Doctors asked about his background while pretending they were only making conversation. Administrators requested brief meetings that somehow stretched longer than promised. Even the security staff began nodding at him differently, as if recalculating where he belonged in the hierarchy of the building. Daniel felt it in his bones. The hospital was no longer just a workplace. It was a net tightening around him. Claire Whitmore noticed it too. From her bed, she watched the way people looked at Daniel now, not past him, but through him, searching for something hidden. She had lived her entire life under that kind of scrutiny. She knew how quickly respect could turn into entitlement, how easily gratitude could morph into ownership. Daniel had not asked for this attention. He had earned it, yes, but not by seeking it. And that made him dangerous to systems that thrived on control. One afternoon, Dr. Susan Miller finally asked the question outright. She waited until Daniel was alone in the supply corridor, far from patient rooms and listening ears. Her tone was careful professional, but her eyes were sharp. "You notice patterns like a trained analyst," she said. "That's not common. Where did you learn it?" Daniel met her gaze calmly, his expression unreadable. "Life," he replied. It was not a lie, but it was not the truth she wanted. Dr. Miller studied him for a long moment, then nodded, understanding that she had reached the edge of something he would not cross. The truth was heavier than anyone guessed. Years before he ever held a mop, Daniel Brooks had worn tailored suits and worked behind glass walls, not unlike the ones surrounding Claire now. He had been a systems engineer for a defense contractor specializing in pattern recognition, anomaly detection, and behavioral modeling. His job had been to see what others missed, to notice the signal buried inside overwhelming noise. He had been very good at it. Too good. When a project went wrong and lives were lost due to decisions made far above his pay grade, Daniel had done the one thing that ended his career overnight. He had refused to stay quiet. The fallout had been swift and absolute. Contracts dissolved, references vanished, warnings arrived wrapped in polite language and legal threats. And then Emily got sick. Cancer did not care about ethics or principles. Daniel had traded courtrooms for hospital rooms, ambition for survival. When Emily died, he walked away from everything that could drag his past back into the light. The janitor job was not a fall from grace. It was armor. Claire sensed pieces of this truth without hearing it spoken. Each night as Daniel cleaned her room, she watched him with growing clarity. His movements were precise, but not rigid. His awareness extended beyond what was immediately visible. He listened to spaces, not just sounds. This was not intuition alone. This was training buried beneath humility and grief. And for the first time since her collapse, Claire felt something close to anger, not at Daniel, but at a world that had forced someone like him into hiding. The tension came to a head when representatives from a research foundation arrived unannounced. They spoke of funding collaboration visibility. They wanted access to Claire, to her data, to the man who had made the critical observation. Daniel listened from the back of the room, arms folded, saying nothing. Claire lay in her bed, fully aware now, her speech slow but functional. When the Foundation's director suggested a public interview with Daniel framed as an inspirational angle, something in her hardened. "No," Claire said firmly. The room fell silent. "He is not part of your narrative." The director blinked, unprepared for resistance. Claire continued, her voice steady despite the effort it cost her. "He did not save me to be studied. He saved me because he noticed. That does not make him your property." After they left, Richard Whitmore sat beside his daughter, pride and concern warring in his expression. "You're protecting him," he said gently. Claire met his eyes. "I know what happens when powerful people decide they deserve access," she replied. Richard did not argue. He understood too well. That night, Daniel lingered by Claire's bed longer than usual. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Claire looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "Yes, I did," she answered. "They see results. I see people." Daniel exhaled slowly, a weight shifting inside him. For years he had survived by staying invisible. For the first time, someone with real power was choosing to shield him rather than expose him. Progress accelerated after that. Claire regained control of her hands, then her legs, each step forward hard-earned and fiercely celebrated. With every milestone, the hospital grew louder with interest. But Claire's authority grew louder still. She set boundaries. She demanded consent. She insisted Daniel remain exactly what he wished to be, nothing more, nothing less. And in doing so, she began to reshape the narrative around her recovery. Daniel watched her transformation with a mixture of admiration and unease. He recognized leadership when he saw it, the kind forged by suffering rather than privilege. Claire was no longer just surviving. She was reclaiming herself. And with that reclamation came an unspoken promise. When she walked out of this hospital, she would not forget who had stood beside her when she could not stand at all. For Daniel Brooks, the danger had not passed. But for the first time in years, it was no longer his alone to carry. By the time Claire Whitmore took her first unassisted steps down the rehabilitation corridor, the story had already begun to escape the hospital's control. Nurses whispered. Administrators made careful phone calls. Emails with carefully chosen words moved upward into boardrooms and foundations far removed from the quiet rooms where suffering had actually occurred. Claire felt it like a pressure change in the air. Her recovery was no longer just a medical success. It was becoming an asset. She hated that. Each step she took felt like a negotiation with her own body. Her legs trembled, muscles burning with the effort of remembering how to obey. Applause followed her progress, soft but persistent, as if encouragement could replace what she had endured. Claire accepted it with a calm nod, but inside she was cataloging everything the way she always had. Who benefited? Who watched too closely? Who spoke about her as if she were no longer in the room? Power, she knew, revealed itself most clearly at moments like this. Daniel Brooks stayed where he always had, just outside the spotlight. He pushed his cart through corridors, now lined with people who smiled at him differently, too brightly, too deliberately. They knew his name. Some even knew his story, or at least the version of it they preferred. Daniel kept his head down, his answers short, his movements precise. Years of survival had taught him that attention was never neutral. It always wanted something. The confrontation came quietly, the way dangerous things often do. Daniel was called into a small administrative office near the loading bay, a place chosen deliberately for its privacy. 2 hospital executives waited inside, polite, well-dressed, their voices warm with professional concern. They thanked him again for his contribution, praised his humility, then presented an offer framed as an opportunity. A consulting role, a temporary advisory position. His insights, they said, were too valuable to waste on night shifts and cleaning schedules. Daniel listened without interrupting. When they finished, he shook his head. "I don't want a title," he said simply. "I want my job." The executives exchanged a glance, surprised, but not deterred. One of them smiled thinner. "With respect, Mr. Brooks," he replied, "that may no longer be your decision." Daniel felt the old tension coil in his chest, familiar and unwelcome. He left the office without another word, the implication hanging heavy in the air. He had seen this pattern before. Institutions rewarded you for being useful, then punished you for refusing to be owned. That night, as he cleaned Claire's room, he said nothing of the meeting. But Claire noticed the shift immediately. His silence had weight now. It pressed against the room. "What did they ask you for?" she said, her voice stronger than it had been days before. Daniel hesitated, then answered honestly. "Control," he said. Claire's jaw tightened. She understood that language fluently. It was the same one board members used when they thought they were being reasonable. She closed her eyes, breathing carefully through the surge of anger rising inside her. This was exactly what she had feared. The system correcting itself by absorbing what threatened it. The next morning, Claire requested a meeting of her own. Not with doctors, not with researchers, but with the hospital's executive board. Richard Whitmore stood beside her wheelchair as she entered the room, silent, but imposing a reminder of the influence standing behind her words. Claire did not waste time. She spoke clearly, deliberately, each sentence chosen with precision. "Daniel Brooks is not your asset," she said. "He is not a consultant, an advisor, or a narrative tool. He is an employee who did his job with care and humanity. Any attempt to coerce him into a role he does not want will be seen as retaliation." The executives shifted uncomfortably. Claire continued her gaze unwavering. If that happens, my family will withdraw every research partnership currently tied to this institution. Immediately. Silence fell thick and unmistakable. No one doubted she could do it. The Whitmore name carried weight not because of money alone, but because of long memory. Lawsuits did not need to be threatened. Reputation was leverage enough. One executive cleared his throat and nodded. That won't be necessary, he said carefully. Mr. Brooks's position will remain unchanged. When Daniel heard what Claire had done, he felt something unfamiliar twist in his chest. Gratitude, yes, but also a deeper emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Being protected, not because he was weak, but because someone with power had chosen to stand in front of him rather than behind him. He did not thank her right away. Words felt insufficient. Instead, he continued to show up each night, steady and present the way he always had. Claire's recovery accelerated after that, as if removing the external pressure allowed her body to focus entirely on healing. She stood longer, walked farther, laughed for the first time in months, a sound that startled everyone in the room, including herself. With each reclaimed movement, her sense of purpose sharpened. She was not simply returning to her old life. She was preparing to change it. One evening, as the city lights flickered beyond the window, Claire asked Daniel a question she'd been holding back. "You weren't always a janitor," she said gently. Daniel did not look up from the card he was organizing. "No," he replied after a moment. "I wasn't." He did not elaborate. Claire did not push. She respected the boundary. Some truths, she knew, had to be offered, not extracted. What mattered was not where Daniel had come from, but what he represented. A reminder that brilliance did not belong exclusively to those with credentials, and integrity often required invisibility to survive. Claire absorbed that lesson deeply. When she left the hospital, she would carry it with her into rooms where decisions were made, rooms that had nearly cost her everything. As Daniel finished cleaning and prepared to leave for the night, Claire watched him go with clear eyes and steady resolve. The world would soon see her again, strong, articulate, commanding. But the quiet man who had noticed her when no one else did would remain exactly where he chose to be. And this time, he would not be alone in that choice. The day Claire Whitmore left Johnsfield Medical Center arrived without ceremony, and that felt intentional. There were no banners in the corridors, no dramatic send-off staged for cameras. Just a quiet morning, pale sunlight filtering through glass, and a woman standing on her own feet for the first time in nearly a year. Claire paused at the threshold of the hospital doors, breathing in the cold Boston air as if testing reality itself. Every sound felt sharper. Every step felt earned. Daniel Brooks watched from a distance, hands wrapped around the handle of his cleaning cart. He had finished his shift an hour earlier, but stayed anyway, unsure why leaving felt wrong. He told himself it was habit. He had spent months moving in and out of Claire's room like a shadow marking time by her progress. Now that she was walking away, something inside him resisted the finality of it. He had never expected to be part of her story beyond those walls. Claire saw him before anyone else did. She turned, scanning the small cluster of staff gathered nearby, until her eyes found Daniel standing back, already half prepared to disappear. Without hesitation, she walked toward him. She walked. The movement drew attention, murmurs spreading as heads turned. Daniel felt the familiar instinct to retreat, but it was too late. Claire stopped in front of him, steady and unflinching. "You're not staying invisible today," she said quietly. Before Daniel could respond, Richard Whitmore joined them, his presence commanding silence, without effort. He looked at Daniel with something deeper than gratitude, now something like respect, forged in shared understanding. "My daughter is speaking this afternoon," Richard said. "She asked that you be there." Daniel opened his mouth to decline, but Claire lifted a hand, stopping him. "Not as a symbol," she added, "as the truth." The press conference was held in a modest auditorium chosen deliberately to avoid spectacle. Reporters filled the seats anyway, notebooks, ready cameras humming softly. Claire stood at the podium, unaided her posture, calm her voice clear. She spoke of recovery, of patience, of science. She acknowledged the doctors, the therapists, the nurses. And then she paused the room, leaning forward with her. "For 6 months, Claire said I was conscious and unheard, surrounded by expertise, but unseen." A ripple moved through the audience. The person who realized I was still there was not a specialist. He did not have a title that demanded attention. He had something else. He paid attention. She turned, then gesturing toward Daniel, seated at the side of the stage. Cameras swung instantly. Daniel felt heat rise in his chest, the weight of dozens of lenses pressing into him. Every instinct screamed to look away. But he didn't. He met the moment head-on, shoulders squared, expression calm. "Daniel Brooks didn't save me because he was brilliant," Claire continued. "He saved me because he cared enough to notice what everyone else dismissed as insignificant." Her voice tightened slightly, emotion breaking through control. "That is not a coincidence. That is a skill, and it deserves respect." The questions came fast after that. Who was Daniel Brooks? How had he known? Why had no one else seen it? Claire answered only what mattered. Daniel was not forced to speak. He was not interrogated. Claire shut down attempts to reframe him as a miracle or anomaly. "He is a person," she said firmly, "not a headline." When the conference ended, the crowd dissolved into controlled chaos. Daniel stood slowly, preparing to slip away before anyone could stop him. But Claire reached him again, this time with a different energy. Purposeful. Forward-looking. "I meant what I said," she told him. "You don't owe anyone an explanation." Daniel nodded. "I never wanted one," he replied. Outside, life resumed its indifferent pace. Cars passed. Sirens wailed in the distance. The world had not changed, not really. But something between them had. Claire extended her hand, not as an heiress, not as a patient, but as an equal. Daniel took it firm and brief. No ceremony, just acknowledgement. That afternoon, Daniel returned to his routine. He picked up Lily from school, listened to her excited recounting of the day, helped her with homework at the kitchen table worn smooth by years of quiet dinners. She looked up at him, suddenly studying his face. "You look different," she said. Daniel smiled faintly. "I feel the same," he answered. But he knew it wasn't entirely true. Because later that night, as Lily slept, Daniel sat alone in the dark and allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. For years he had believed survival required shrinking, staying unnoticed, letting the world move past him. Claire had disrupted that belief without forcing him to change who he was. She had shown him something he had forgotten, that being seen did not always mean being consumed. Across the city, Claire stood in her penthouse, looking out over lights that once defined her sense of power. They looked different now, less absolute, more fragile. She thought of the months she had spent trapped inside her own mind, of the systems that had failed her, not out of cruelty, but complacency. And she thought of Daniel Brooks as the man who had reminded her that the most dangerous blind spot in any institution was the assumption that worth could be measured by status. She made a decision that night, one she did not announce publicly. The Brooks Scholarship Fund would begin quietly supporting children of single parents, pursuing medical and scientific education. No press release, no branding, just opportunity. Because the lesson Daniel had given her was not about recognition, it was about responsibility. 2 lives returned to their paths that evening, separate but permanently altered. One stepped back into power with new eyes. The other returned to quiet with new certainty. And neither would ever forget that sometimes the most meaningful change begins when someone chooses to truly see another human being. 6 months passed, and the world slowly adjusted to the reality that Claire Whitmore was no longer a mystery, confined to a hospital bed. She returned to life with intention, moving carefully, as if every decision deserved to be examined before it was trusted. The woman who stepped back into public view was not the same one who had collapsed without warning. This Claire carried silence inside her, not as weakness, but as memory. She had learned what it meant to exist without a voice, to be present while unseen. And that knowledge reshaped everything she touched from that day forward. Her re-entry into Whitmore Biotech was deliberately quiet. There were no press releases, no ceremonial welcomes, no rehearsed speeches meant to reassure investors. She walked the glass corridors alone, observing faces, movements, pauses. Meetings felt different under her presence. She spoke less, listened more, and allowed silence to stretch until assumptions revealed themselves. When executives rushed toward conclusions, she slowed them down. When analysts dismissed anomalies, she asked why. Certainty, she had learned, was often the most dangerous thing in any room. Claire's leadership evolved into something unfamiliar, even to those who had worked beside her for years. Authority no longer came from control, but from attention. She watched who hesitated before speaking. She noticed whose ideas were routinely interrupted or ignored. She remembered what it felt like to be surrounded by experts who spoke confidently while missing the truth entirely. Under her direction, processes changed subtly. Data reviews widened. Peripheral observations were logged instead of discarded. The culture shifted not through mandates, but through example. Daniel Brooks observed none of this directly. He did not follow business headlines or industry updates. His life remained rooted in routine, in early mornings and quiet evenings, in preparing breakfast for Lily, and listening to her recount her day. Yet even from the margins, he felt the ripple of change. At the hospital, new procedures appeared without explanation. Night staff were invited into discussions. Custodial reports were reviewed instead of archived. Daniel recognized the pattern immediately. Someone had insisted on listening. Lily flourished in ways that surprised even her teachers. Her asthma stabilized, her confidence grew, and her curiosity sharpened into something persistent and thoughtful. She asked questions that made adults pause. She noticed classmates who sat alone, patients who seemed frightened, and moments when people spoke without truly hearing one another. Daniel watched these instincts develop with quiet pride. He had never instructed her to be this way. He had simply shown her every day what attention looked like in practice. The scholarship fund began exactly as Claire intended. There were no galas, no donor walls, no branding campaigns. Applications were reviewed without photographs, without legacy markers, without assumptions about worth. Context mattered more than polish. Effort mattered more than presentation. Lily never knew where the support came from, and Daniel made sure it stayed that way. Gratitude, he believed, should never arrive with obligation attached, especially for a child still learning how the world worked. One evening, Daniel received a simple envelope in the mail. There was no return address, no corporate seal. Inside was a handwritten note, restrained and precise. Claire thanked him again, not for saving her life, but for changing how she understood it. She wrote about responsibility, about power, about the danger of systems that stopped listening to the quietest voices within them. Daniel read the note, once folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer beside old photographs of Emily and Lily. He did not frame it. He did not reply. Some acknowledgments did not require response to remain meaningful. Claire's case eventually entered medical literature, stripped of names and spectacle, reduced to data and methodology. It was praised, debated, cited in conferences and journals. Protocols were adjusted. Training modules were revised. Claire attended none of the discussions. She knew that the most important element of her survival could not be captured in charts or conclusions. It existed in the space between what was measured and what was noticed, and she intended to keep that space visible through action rather than explanation. Years later, when Claire spoke to a graduating class at a modest medical school far from cameras, she told her story without drama. She spoke about humility as a clinical skill rather than a personality trait. She described curiosity as an ethical obligation. She explained that listening was not kindness, but responsibility. She told them about a patient who could not speak and a system that assumed silence meant absence. She never mentioned Daniel Brooks by name. She did not need to. The lesson stood on its own. Daniel continued to live quietly. He attended Lily's school events, fixed what broke, cooked simple meals, and listened more than he spoke. Sometimes he glimpsed echoes of the life he had once lived in. Passing conversations or news stories, but he felt no pull toward it. He had learned that influence did not require visibility. It required consistency, presence, and care, applied without expectation of reward. One afternoon, Daniel ran into Dr. Susan Miller at a grocery store. They recognized each other, instantly shared a brief smile, then stood awkwardly between shelves of canned food. She thanked him again, her voice softer, now stripped of professional distance. She told him he had reminded them of something important. Daniel shook his head gently and said they had already known it. They had only needed a reason to see it. Dr. Miller nodded, understanding more than she said aloud. Claire returned to Johnsfield Medical Center once each year, unannounced. She walked the halls at night, speaking with custodians, listening to nurses, asking questions no one else asked. She remembered what it felt like to be present and unheard. She refused to let that become someone else's story if she could prevent it. Over time, staff noticed. Practices shifted. Culture followed. In quieter moments, Claire reflected on the intersection that had changed her life. She had been born into power and nearly lost herself to its blind spots. Daniel had learned to hide his power to survive. Between them existed a truth neither could ignore. Systems rarely failed because of cruelty alone. They failed because they stopped listening. On a winter night, snow fell softly over the city. Daniel stood by his apartment window, watching Lily finish her homework, her brow furrowed in concentration. The world outside was cold and indifferent. Inside there was warmth, focus, and care. Daniel felt no need to be anything more than what he was. He had learned that significance did not require recognition. It required attention offered consistently and without condition. That same night, Claire stood at her own window, city lights stretching endlessly below. She no longer mistook height for perspective. The higher she rose, the more carefully she listened downward. Survival had taught her that leadership was not about standing above others, but about noticing who had been standing beneath you all along. Their lives did not intertwine again in dramatic fashion. There were no staged reunions, no revisited speeches, no sentimental callbacks. And that was precisely the point. The impact of what they shared did not depend on repetition. It lived quietly in altered decisions, changed paths in children who would one day notice what others overlooked. In the end, the most powerful transformation did not belong solely to the woman who reclaimed her voice or the man who never lost his. It belonged to the understanding they left behind, that sometimes the difference between losing someone and saving them comes down to one small thing. Someone choosing to pay attention when everyone else has already decided there is nothing left to hear. From an expert perspective, the most powerful lesson in this story is not the medical breakthrough or the dramatic reversal of fate. It is the systemic blind spot it exposes. When institutions rely too heavily on credentials, protocols, and hierarchy, they often overlook the most critical element of all human observation. In medicine, leadership, and everyday life, progress does not always come from more data, but from better attention. The difference between failure and breakthrough is often found in the smallest, quietest details. Daniel's role reminds us that competence and insight are not owned by titles. True expertise is not just what you know, but how deeply you are willing to notice, listen, and care. Claire's recovery shows that power, when reshaped by humility, can transform not only an individual life, but the systems around it. This is not a story about luck. It is a story about awareness, responsibility, and the courage to question assumptions. If this story made you pause and reflect on how often we underestimate people based on appearances, take a moment to like this video. If you want more stories that challenge status, highlight hidden strength, and reveal the human truth beneath power, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And now, leave a comment with a short phrase that captures this story for you. 3 words or fewer. Suggested comment: pay attention.